All right, we're going to take a deep dive into a word that, let's be honest, carries a ton of weight: anthrax. We're going to peel back the headlines to really understand the full story of this fascinating and, pretty misunderstood disease. So let me just ask you something right off the bat. When you hear that word, anthrax, what's the first image that just pops into your head? For most of us, I think it triggers some very specific memories and maybe even some fears. Yeah, I am willing to bet that for a lot of you, it's bioterrorism, right? You're thinking about the attacks back in 2001. And look, while that is an absolutely crucial part of its modern history, it's really just a tiny, tiny piece of a much bigger, much older, and completely natural story. And that's the story we're going to get into today. So here's our game plan. First, we'll get beyond those headlines. Then we'll dig into the bacterium's secret life, figure out how it spreads, look at the different ways the disease shows up, and wrap up with our public health playbook for dealing with it. Okay, Section 1, Beyond the Headlines. The absolute key to understanding anthrax is to stop thinking of it as just a weapon and start seeing it for what it truly is: a natural disease, a zoonotic disease. So what in the world is a zoonosis? Well, simply put, it's any infectious disease that can jump from an animal to a person. You've heard of them: rabies, bird flu. And yes, anthrax is a textbook example. And this is so important. Its story doesn't begin in a lab. It begins out in nature, with animals, especially grazing animals like cattle, sheep, and goats. All right, Section 2. Let's meet the main character in this whole story, the microscopic culprit behind it all. Its official name is Bacillus anthracis. So this is our guy. It's a rod-shaped bacterium. But the most important part of that description is right there in the middle: spore forming. That little trait, that is its secret weapon. That's the key to its incredible ability to stick around. You see, this bacterium has a superpower. Seriously. When conditions get tough, it doesn't just die off. Nope, it transforms itself into this super tough, highly resistant spore. Just think of it like a tiny seed wearing a suit of armor. In this dormant state, it can just hang out in the soil for decades, just waiting for a host to come along so it can wake up and get back to business. And that brings us right to Section 3. How does this thing actually spread? Let's trace that path from a sleepy little spore in the dirt all the way to an active infection. So the main cycle starts in the soil, where those spores are just waiting around. A grazing animal, say a cow, comes along and accidentally eats some of those spores while it's munching on grass. Inside the animal, the spores wake up and cause the disease. Humans then come into the picture, usually through some kind of contact with these infected animals or their products, things like wool, hides, or leather. So how does that exposure to humans actually happen? Well, it boils down to three main routes. By far the most common is direct skin contact. This happens to people like farmers, vets, or folks who work with animal products. Less common is actually eating undercooked meat from an animal that was infected. And the rarest way, at least in nature, is breathing in the spores if they somehow get kicked up into the air. Now, this is a really, really important point, and it's one that helps cut through a lot of unnecessary fear. Unlike something like the flu or a common cold, anthrax isn't really considered contagious. It doesn't spread from one person to another. You get it from the source, those spores in the environment, not from a person who happens to be sick. Okay, on to Section 4, the disease's different faces. Because, you see, how you get exposed to anthrax totally changes the kind of sickness you get. It's not just one disease. It actually shows up in 4 very distinct ways. So here are the 4 forms. First, there's cutaneous, which is from skin contact. It gives you this very unique, painless ulcer with a black center. Then there's inhalational, from breathing in spores, which causes really severe breathing problems. Third is gastrointestinal, from eating bad meat, leading to some awful abdominal issues. And last, there's injection anthrax, a very rare form, which causes a deep, severe infection under the skin. And here's a statistic that really puts things into perspective. While we hear a lot about inhalational anthrax because it's so dangerous, it's also incredibly rare. More than 95% of all naturally occurring human anthrax cases around the world are the cutaneous kind, that skin form. And the good news there is that it's also the most easily treated and the least deadly. It's actually kind of fascinating to see how differently the disease behaves. In animals, its main hosts, it's often super fast and deadly, sometimes causing sudden death with almost no warning. But in humans, it's a much more varied illness. You get those 4 distinct forms we just talked about, and each one is tied directly to how the spores manage to get inside the body. So all of this leads us to our final and probably most important section, our public health playbook. How do we actually diagnose, treat, and best of all, prevent this disease? So if a doctor suspects anthrax, how do they know for sure? Well, they've got a few key tools. They can take a sample, like a swab from one of those skin sores, and literally grow the bacteria in the lab. Modern PCR tests are super fast and can spot the bacterium's DNA. Other tests can actually find the specific toxins the bacteria release. And for that inhalation form, a chest X-ray has a classic telltale sign they look for. Once it's diagnosed, treatment is like a 3-pronged attack. Pillar number 1 is a course of powerful antibiotics to kill the bacteria themselves. For the really severe cases, pillar 2 is antitoxins, which go after the poisons the bacteria have already pumped out. And the third pillar is just good old supportive care, managing all the symptoms, especially in a hospital. But you know what's better than treatment? Prevention. If someone's been exposed, they can take antibiotics right away to stop the infection before it even starts. There is also a vaccine, but it's not for everybody. It's reserved for people in high-risk jobs, like vets, some lab workers, and the military. For the rest of us, the best prevention is just common sense, avoiding contact with sick animals or their products. And this really shows that the best way to protect people is to control the disease in animals in the first place. This means vaccinating livestock in areas where anthrax is known to exist and being extremely careful about how you dispose of any animal that dies from it, usually through incineration. You want to destroy those spores so they can't get back into the soil. So when you put it all together, what's the big takeaway here? It's this. When you strip away the fear and the headlines, anthrax is a well-understood, naturally occurring disease. And even more importantly, it's a manageable one. We have a really robust public health defense system ready to diagnose, treat, and prevent it. At the end of the day, the story of anthrax is just this powerful reminder that our health is completely, totally intertwined with the health of animals and the environment that we all share. It's a perfect example of what scientists call the One Health concept. And that kind of leaves us with one final thought. What's the next big challenge that this fundamental connection is going to reveal?